Hello, I want to show you this charcoal drawing of mountains with snowy tops. I used images of Mount Index in Washington for my reference, and I like the contrast and the shapes I achieved here. These are my tools. I used charcoal pencils and vine charcoal for drawing. I used a pencil eraser for drawing highlights, and I used these brushes of various sizes for spreading the charcoal and blending it. Now let's talk a little bit about the drawing, and I'm going to take you through the drawing process. As you can see, I'm sharpening one of my woodless charcoal pencils, and I'm leaving the residue of the charcoal powder on my paper. I'm going to use that to establish some darker tones here. You can also buy charcoal powder, but you can also make it yourself. I'm going to do this in several stages, by the way. The paper that I'm working on is about 9 times 12 inches in size. Now I grabbed one of the smaller brushes and I'm going to try to push that charcoal around a little bit, push it into these edges, to the corners, and see how it works. It's blending pretty well. I'm spreading the charcoal nicely, but it's not yet very smooth. I'm going to get it to look smooth eventually. Now I'm going to grab a larger brush to make this a little bit faster and to cover a larger area. So I want to make the edges and the corners a little bit darker, especially on the lower side of the paper. And I kind of want to make it a little bit lighter towards the middle, because that's where the mountain tops will be. So I'm spreading that with a large brush. It's a bristle brush. And now on top of that charcoal powder that I created from woodless charcoal pencils, I'm adding some vine charcoal. Now why didn't I do all of this in charcoal powder or just vine charcoal? Well, they both have their advantages. I think the charcoal from woodless charcoal pencils is a lot darker, so I used the brushes to push it into the paper to create some of these darkest areas on my paper. And vine charcoal doesn't really achieve such dark tones, plus it can be moved around more easily. So I'm going to be adding this vine charcoal on top of these areas to make everything look smoother, but also to have more vine charcoal in those areas where more erasing will be needed, because it's easier to lift up or erase vine charcoal than it is compressed charcoal. So I'm just going to cover that with vine charcoal, and it doesn't look like much now. It looks like a mess. But as you can see, now I grabbed a paper towel and I'm using that to blend everything really smoothly. And now you might be asking, well, why didn't you only blend with a paper towel instead of the brushes? Well, again, both of these blending tools have their own advantages. brushes tend to make things a little bit darker when you blend with them, because they push the charcoal into the grain of the paper, whereas the paper towel and napkins, they tend to make everything a little bit softer and smoother, but at the same time they take away a little bit of the value and make everything a little bit lighter. So I think I established a fairly nice, smooth, fairly even grey tone, with some darker areas here and there where I wanted them. And now I'm using woodless charcoal pencil. It's a medium charcoal pencil, and it's pretty well sharpened, and I'm using it to start drawing the mountain peaks. I'm going to start with these darker areas, the areas which are getting less light, and then I'm going to draw highlights next to them with my eraser. But the reason why I'm starting with these darker areas is to give myself a clearer idea where the mountain and the mountain peaks are going to be. Now, if you're wondering how I'm achieving this texture, well, it's not really easy to explain it. You just scribble a little bit and try to imitate the appearance of rocks. I think the key will be achieving a sufficient amount of contrast. And speaking of that, I am now moving on to my pencil eraser. It's an eraser and a pencil which can be sharpened, and I'm using that to draw highlights, to draw these lighter portions of the mountain peak, and you can see how much they stand out now against the background. You could achieve a similar effect if you were using a toned paper and white charcoal or chalk, but I just find this approach better. Now I'm gonna leave that mountain for now, and I'm just adding a little bit more vine charcoal here and there because I want a cloudy dark sky in the background. So I'm just adding a little bit of vine charcoal and spreading it with a brush, just to make some suggestions of dark clouds in the background. And once I blend that smoothly, and once I am satisfied with the amount of value, I'm going to try to work on their shape a little bit. You can see that I'm trying to make them look like clouds, trying to make them look wispy, and create some irregular cloudy or cloud-like shapes. You can also see that I'm using my paper towel to pick up some of the charcoal in order to create highlights on the clouds. Clouds are also 3D objects, they need to be shaded as well. My light source is coming from the right side, so I'm making the right side of everything, both the clouds and the mountain, a little bit lighter. And I'm just trying to create these irregular, wispy edges of clouds. Occasionally I can use a shorter, stiff brush to push the charcoal a little bit deeper into the paper when I'm sure that I'm happy with the shape and I'm not gonna modify it much. And now I'm back on the mountain. You can see how I'm making these very short strokes to suggest the shapes of some rocks, and then on top of that I'm erasing some of that charcoal from the charcoal powder and the vine charcoal. And you can see how much these areas these lighter areas stand out. It's almost as if I were using white paint or a white pencil or something. That's the kind of contrast that I was going for, and it's the kind of contrast that is needed to make this look realistic. I really want that mountain peak to stand out against everything, the background, the clouds, and the rest of the mountain. So you can see that I'm using a similar approach with my pencil eraser. I'm making short interrupted motions, just like I'm doing with a charcoal pencil. I want to create that rock-like texture, very rough looking surface. But you can also see that I'm leaving some of the areas in between. That will be my mid-tone. And now I'm moving to the area to the left of the mountain, and you can see that I'm drawing some vertical irregular shapes. Those are going to be the trees. I'm going to draw some trees around and at the bottom of the mountain. So now I'm going back in these areas of shadow which are mostly going to be grayish, but I'm also adding some darker tones to make that surface a little bit more interesting. Again, like I said, I'm trying to imitate the appearance of rocks. And obviously it's not going to look like the reference photo. It's just, I'm just trying to look something that'll look, I'm just trying to create something that'll look realistic enough. But I think the key will be the contrast here. Anyway, I'm making some more suggestions of trees and these rocks in the foreground. There will be more of these coniferous trees on the slopes of the mountain, and I'm adding some more value here with a vine charcoal because I want the sky to appear a little bit darker here, and I want this area to stand out a little bit more. So I'm adding some individual trees or clusters of trees, but also in addition to them I'm adding some patches of darker value which will be there to suggest rocky terrain in between the trees, or some patches which aren't covered with snow. So like I said, I'm going to group most of these trees in smaller clusters. This is the left side of the mountain. It's going to be a lot darker. But I am going to be blending that as well because I don't want that rough grainy texture. I'm going to soften that a little bit. So this area here was kind of boring because I just obviously I can't imitate my reference photo, and I have to make some suggestions of trees and rocks. So I just did a little bit of scribbling, just adding some patches of darker value here and there. And initially it didn't look like much, but eventually I'm going to do my best to explain it to the viewer and to make sense of it by creating areas of contrast between lighter and darker value. And now I'm using a pencil eraser to take away some of the value to make some of these areas a little bit darker. And now, as you can see, I'm using a brush to soften some of that texture. And I can also use blending stumps to soften the texture on these trees, because I want less texture on whatever it is in the background. So once again, like I said, I like to combine different types of tools, and when I was establishing my midtone, I used both the charcoal powder and vine charcoal. When I was blending, I used both the brushes and the paper towel, because you just have to get to know your tools, you have to practice with them and adapt to them, and just try to use some of their advantages. That's just the way it is. And that's the way it is with any types of materials that you're using. People often ask me about the kind of paper that I'm using, the kinds of pencils that I'm using. I really think that brands are not that important. You just have to work with what you have and try to adapt to it. I can use any brand, but when it comes to charcoal pencils, I tend to prefer charcoal pencils which can be sharpened. That's my main criterion. That's the most important criterion for me. Just as long as they don't break, they're good for me. I tend to use woodless charcoal pencils because I can really get the most value out of them. You can just use them for many drawings before they're used up. And as for paper, again, it's really not that important. I use a cheap local brand that I don't even know the name of. I just know that it's thicker because I prefer thicker paper. But you can use whatever you like, and the same goes for brushes and erasers as well. This area to the left doesn't look like much now still. I added some patches of trees and I added some lighter and darker areas. Right now it doesn't make too much sense, but I'm starting to suggest that these are slopes of a mountain and that there are some trees there, so as I work and as I add more detail, it will start to look better. Now, on the right, as you can see, I'm starting on an area of darker value. This is going to be another mountain peak and another ridge, which is connected to the first one. So its left side is also, the side that is facing us is going to be darker, and then the right side and the tops will be a little bit lighter, just like the first one. I don't want them exactly to fade into towards the edges, but I kind of want everything to get darker and blurrier towards the edges a little bit, if that makes sense, so that the mountain peak would stand out more. So now I'm adding some more of these trees. You can see that I'm using a very simple technique for drawing these coniferous trees. I just draw a vertical line and some horizontal shapes to suggest what roughly a coniferous tree would look like. And you can see that I'm making the ones that are closer to the viewer, the ones that are in the foreground, I'm making them a little bit larger, and those in the background are quite a bit smaller. Now this is where the shape of these rocks gets a little bit weird, but as long as I remember where my light source is and create enough contrast, I'll be able to sell it as a realistic looking mountain. So I'm working on this peak here, on this part of the ridge to the right, which is going to be fairly dark. And I want this area a lot darker. Again, I'm using a brush to soften some of that texture, to blend that, because I don't want it to have too much texture to appear too detailed. I want everything just a little bit softer. I gotta make these areas here in between the trees and on the slopes a little bit lighter, and to do that I don't have to press. I can just pull my eraser gently across some of these areas, make them a little bit lighter. So just like you can vary the amount of pressure with a pencil, you can do the same thing with your eraser. And I'm doing the same thing here with this mountain peak. I used a little more pressure to get nicer, cleaner, lighter values near the top. And the ones down here, they can be a little bit darker, and I don't really need as much contrast. There's a rough area over there. I'm trying to make sense of it. But like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm now going to draw a few highlights here on the other part of the ridge, this other peak. Just a few suggestions of lighter areas which are sunlit, which are getting more light, and that should be enough. Occasionally I can use a brush to subdue some of these lighter values which stand out too much, and I can do the same thing with some of the darker values. And I can also do that to control the amount of detail and texture. And I want to soften an area and make it a little more blurry with a little less contrast maybe. Now I'm going to keep working on these trees here and add just a few more of these darker rocks and darker patches in the foreground, because I have a large empty space here in the middle, so I have to make that a little more interesting. This terrain is not quite as rough and rocky as near the top, but I need to add some detail there as well. And I need to make this portion of the ridge to the right a little bit darker and give it a little more texture as well, and kind of establish connection with the slope here by adding some of these darker areas under it. So I'm also adding some darker lines and spots here and there among the highlighted area to make it look like some of the rocks which stand out a little bit. And to make the surface of the mountain appear a little more rough and jagged. But the part near the bottom of that peak, I'm going to make that a little bit smoother. Like there are a couple of these smaller slopes leading from the peak to this larger slope in the middle. And there's also going to be a few of these trees on that large slope as well, scattered here and there. Just adding a few more trees. And I need a little more contrast here. I'm going to add a few more trees here in the foreground as well, but they're kind of going to be blended in with this darker area to the right, so that only some of them stand out against the lighter value of that slope in the middle. And now I'm using a brush to soften some of these shapes a little bit, so that there isn't too much texture, too much detail there. I want everything to look as though it's in the distance, and some of it is to be slightly blurry, and the lighting is generally soft, with only these couple of peaks getting more light and standing out against the murky sky. You can see that I'm using a large brush a lot, but just like I vary my pressure with pencils and erasers, I can do the same thing with a brush. I can sometimes go over certain areas very, very lightly, not to ruin the texture or detail. I'm adding a few of these distant ridges here, a few of these distant peaks rather here, and I'm doing that with a vine charcoal stick because I want that to be a little bit lighter and I want to blend that easily, and I'm also going to make parts of it kind of blurry. I don't want all the edges to be clean. Now you see that I added a little bit of charcoal powder on the edges, and I'm going to go over that gently with a large brush just to darken some of these areas to make the middle part stand out even more. So that, I think, is a nice effect, so that the entire scene is kind of darker around the edges and getting lighter towards the middle. That was my initial idea anyway, and I'm working towards that goal. I'm also using the same vine charcoal stick to add a few more clouds and make a few suggestions of these darker clouds in the distance. just playing around with that vine charcoal, which can be moved around, just playing around with it a little bit and trying to come up with the shapes that I like. And occasionally I can always use my paper towel to pick up some of the charcoal and make some of these areas a little bit lighter. Here I can go over certain areas with a brush to make them a little bit darker, and then go back with a pencil eraser to make certain areas stand out a little more. So just playing around with the lighting, playing around with value and contrast to see what kind of shapes I can come up with. I'm just drawing some lighter areas here as well, although I will go over them a little bit with a brush to subdue them. But I'm trying to make a connection with this slope here. So I'm just going to add a few of these lighter areas near the bottom of that peak. I'm kind of trying to keep in mind where my light source is and to stay consistent with it, even though the mountain has a lot of weird and unpredictable rough shapes, so not everything will be easy to explain to the eye. Of course, you can always simplify it a little bit. You can see that I added a little bit of charcoal powder here because I wanted these slopes to be a little bit darker, again with the same purpose of highlighting this peak. I kind of spoiled this mountain peak in the distance, so I'm just going to go over it with a brush and push a little more charcoal powder there to fix it. At this point I'm just trying to add some of the finer details, just trying to clean up some of these edges and maybe throw in a few more highlights here and there. To make some of these rocky areas stand out a little more. This scene is a little bit darker than my usual landscapes, but then again, when you're working with charcoal, you're gonna tend to have a lot of darker tones because charcoal is good for that. And that's also one of the advantages of charcoal, because to do this with graphite, I think it would take a lot more time. But maybe some other type of medium would be a lot faster than charcoal, who knows. I mean, Bob Ross used to do a lot of these paintings of mountains, and he can create a scene like that in probably around 15 minutes or less. This whole drawing took about an hour and a half in real time. So as you can see in this narrated video, I wanted to show some parts of it in real time, and some of it are in time lapse. All in all, it's about 36-37 minutes, but like I said, in real time, the whole drawing, the whole scene took me about an hour and a half, probably no more than that. blurring these trees towards the edges a little bit more. So there's more detail and more contrast in the middle, and things get kind of blurrier towards the edges. Now I'm going to spray this with a fixative and remove the tape, but first I have to sign it here in the lower right corner. A small signature with my pencil eraser, and I think I'm pretty much done. I'm going to remove the tape, spray it with fixative, and here it is, the finished drawing. I hope you enjoyed this narrated video of a mountain drawing. I'll see you in the next video. Please do subscribe to my channel, check out my other videos, click the notification icon. Bye for now.